Well, good afternoon, everybody. This hearing will come to order. Today, we will hear from the OMB Director Shaun Donovan, who has the dubious distinction of submitting for the first time in our nation's history a $4 trillion budget. This record level of spending corresponds with a record level of revenue. However, it still isn't enough to balance the budget. So another $600 billion is added to the federal debt, which in gross terms now exceeds $20 trillion for the first time. It took 233 years to incur the first $10 trillion in debt, and it took only 8 short years to incur the next $10 trillion in debt. Now, the only way to retire the federal debt is for spending as a percentage of GDP to be lower than its historical average, and for revenue as a percentage of GDP to be higher than its historical revenue. The budget before us, however, projects that both spending and revenue as a percentage of GDP will remain above their historical average through 2026. In other words, this budget is a permanent source of debt. As a percentage of GDP, gross debt hovers around 105%. Now, that's a level that has not been seen or tolerated since the end of World War II. And I think we'd all be a little afraid if the country became acclimated to this level of debt. So make no mistake, it's an economic burden that threatens the living standards of future generations. As such, I'm disappointed that the administration's final budget request to Congress did not propose any substantive entitlement reforms to prevent any further intergenerational inequity, let alone not one substantial entitlement reform in the last 8 years. Back in 2000, there was talk about retiring the federal debt by 2013, and now the federal debt has eclipsed our GDP. Now, the Office of Management and Budget has the great responsibility of constructing a budget that reflects the President's vision for our country. And because of this responsibility, I believe OMB has an even greater responsibility to be judicious and deliberate with its own budget request. And so today, I hope not only to have an informative discussion about OMB's appropriations request, but also to dive into some of the important policies and assumptions included in the President's overall request. Now, for fiscal year 2017, OMB is requesting a 6% increase over last year's level. That's just a little bit under $101 million. In addition, the budget requests a significant increase for IT account at 17% over last year. Now, I appreciate the strides the administration has made to improve the use of IT resources all across the government, to increase efficiency, to reduce waste and identify savings. However, at a time where our nation is incurring significant debt for generations to come, I think OMB should be exercising even greater fiscal restraint. And may I remind the Director that when the President first took office, in 2008, OMB received $78 million. Therefore, I believe your agency, again, has a greater duty to lead by example and to live within the means of your own budget. I'd also like to discuss the role of OMB has in strengthening federal cybersecurity and the steps the federal government is taking to prevent the kind of IT failure we saw with the breaches of OPM's background security and personnel database. More and more, we're seeing threats to our national security via cyber attacks and our networks and operating systems. OMB's role in guiding and coordinating cyber policy is very, very important. Today, I hope we can talk about the Department of Labor's proposed fiduciary standard rule. As you know, last month, the Department of Labor submitted its rule to redefine fiduciary standards to OMB for its mandatory review. And I'll have some questions about this because OMB has a critical task of reviewing all the federal regulations to ensure all proposed regulations keep pace with modern technology, promote the changing needs of society, and avoid duplicative and inconsistent policies. I believe the Department of Labor's rule will significantly harm low and middle income investors seeking financial advice regarding their retirement and will cause unintended consequences to many Americans' IRA accounts by limiting their access to investment advice provided to many small account holders. At a time when many Americans lack adequate retirement savings, we should be empowering families to save more in retirement by preserving access to all forms of affordable investment advice. And finally, I want to talk some today about the administration's inadequate proposal to fund the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm very disappointed the administration chose to ignore the importance of our nation's ports and waterways as we move toward a larger post-Panamax ships. Ensuring that ports are dredged deep enough to handle these larger ships is essential to secure America's place in a global competitive market. For instance, in Jacksonville, Florida, my home district, Jacksport, our local port, is a major economic driver in the community. Jacksport supports more than 132,000 jobs and has an economic impact of about $27 billion in the Northeast Florida region. And unfortunately, the President's budget not only cut the Army Corps of Engineers funding by 22%, but it doesn't fund a single new deep draft navigation project. In order to modernize our federal navigation channels, we need a budget that reflects the needs of our nation's ports. And so I'm hoping to hear from you, Director, today on why the administration woefully underfunded the Army Corps of Engineers and about the decision to fund only one new START project in the 2017 budget request. But again, I want to thank you, Director Donovan, for taking the time to be with us today. I look forward to your testimony. And now I'd like to turn to the ranking member, Mr. Serrano, for any opening remarks he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want you to know that you just cost me $1. I bet someone that you would say something positive about the budget, and I didn't hear it. Maybe I skipped it.
Yeah, I said something nice about the IT stuff.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Thank you, Chairman Crenshaw. I would like to join you in welcoming Shaun Donovan, Director of the Office of Management and Budget, to this hearing. Today's hearing serves a dual purpose. We will, of course, discuss OMB's specific budget request for this year and delve into the new initiatives that will help coordinate government-wide responses to pressing issues. But we will also delve into the budget request as a whole and how OMB has helped to put together a coherent and cohesive product that reflects our nation's values and addresses its needs. That secondary role is especially important for this year's context, because this year our majority colleagues on the Budget Committee have taken the unprecedented step of refusing to invite Director Donovan to testify on the administration's budget. I think that decision is unwise at best. With that in mind, I want to commend Chairman Crenshaw for his decision to hold a hearing today. I think it speaks well of the Appropriations Committee's more bipartisan nature. Although we may have differences of opinion about what our policy priorities should be, I am glad to know that the Chairman believes that we should hear all sides of the debate, and I'm very serious and sincere about that, Mr. Chairman. And I think it is especially necessary to hear what Director Donovan has to say about the fiscal year 2017 budget as a whole. I believe that the President's request, prepared with your counsel, creates a strategic plan that strengthens our economy and invests in working families by improving access to early and higher education, as well as affordable health care, investing in our infrastructure, and partnering with local communities and businesses to create a good-paying job and affordable housing. I commend OMB for your role in these efforts. There's also much to discuss in OMB's request as well, which totals $100.7 million in FY 2017. This includes a relatively small increase of $5.7 million to help ensure you have the personnel and the tools necessary to meet these numerous responsibilities. It is important to note that out of the requested increase, $2.4 million are for unavoidable costs such as salary increases, higher rental costs, and IT contractor support. The other $3.3 million would help OMB restore a portion of previous staff cuts at a time when OMB has taken on numerous new responsibilities mandated by Congress. OMB's current staffing levels are 7% below 2010, levels and would still be 5% below 2010 levels even if OMB receives its full 2017 funding request. We need to make sure that OMB has the resources necessary to do its job. I'm also interested in hearing about the implementation of the Cybersecurity National Action Plan and OMB's role in developing and coordinating federal IT cybersecurity strategy and policy. I hope we will have a chance to discuss all these issues in further detail today. Thank you for your service and for appearing before this subcommittee. I look forward to hearing about your priorities for 2017, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. I'd like now to yield to Mr. Rogers, who's the chairman of the full committee, for any opening statement he might like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Donovan, we were pleased to have you with us to discuss the President's fiscal year 2017 request for OMB, as well as some recurring themes in the overall request. This marks the 8th and final budget request under the Obama administration, which you've been a part of from the very beginning. While we may not agree on everything, I've enjoyed working with you over the years and appreciate your service to the country. For fiscal 17, as has been said, you've requested $100.7 million, which is about $5.7 million over fiscal 16. These additional funds are proposed to hire more staff, raise pay and benefits, and for increases in rental and IT costs. As you know, we're in very tight fiscal times. So any request for additional dollars is met with extra scrutiny in this committee. That's our job. Your relatively small agency plays a critical role in overseeing the administration of the entire executive branch. And it's important that this committee assess the strength of the President's budget request as a whole. As you're aware, in December, Congress and the President came to an agreement to set budget caps for fiscal 16 and 17. So I'm disappointed, not surprised, that this year's budget request seeks at every turn to circumvent the terms and the spirit of that agreement. Year after year, this committee has rejected the administration's attempts to evade statutory discretionary spending caps by proposing new and unrealistic programs on the mandatory side of the ledger. And yet here again, this budget, which you have drafted, shifts tens of billions of dollars from discretionary funding over to mandatory. If we were to blindly follow the President down this path, by 2020, our country would spend more money on interest payments on the national debt than we would on protecting and defending our nation. Instead of proposing real solutions to help our nation's fiscal house in order, the President has chosen only to exacerbate the problem. And while I've sadly come to expect the budget request to be a political document, this year I'm especially disappointed in two proposals in particular. First, despite bipartisan efforts in the past several years to increase funding for medical research, this budget opts instead to politicize the issue, proposing the $1 billion cancer moonshot through mandatory spending, outside the terms of the balanced budget agreement and outside the scope of this committee's jurisdiction. The same goes for the proposal related to our nation's deadly opioid epidemic. Our country loses over 100 lives a day to heroin and prescription drug overdoses. That's over 100 families every day that lose a son, a daughter, a father due to this tragic scourge. And don't mishear me. I've enjoyed working in a bipartisan fashion with the administration, with a number of dedicated individuals to curb the tide of abuse, to help save those lives and those families. I believe we've made some real progress, and I do not question their commitment. However, when we receive a $1 billion proposal in mandatory funding to address this pressing problem, I do have to question the sincerity and seriousness of the request. It's unquestionable that funding for NIH and for treatment and law enforcement to fight against drug abuse. Those are important, admirable goals that we all share on a bipartisan basis. But here, we've got to make tough choices and prioritize. And this budget request is completely devoid of that leadership. Again, I'm not surprised, but I'm truly disappointed. And let's move on now to the global Zika virus emergency. The committee has received the President's supplemental appropriations request for Zika. We're reviewing it carefully. But I'm disappointed you didn't take our committee's recommendation to use unobligated Ebola and other disease funds for the immediate response to Zika, which we offered to backfill as needed in the fiscal 17 bills. I think you will eventually regret that decision. The supplemental you've requested will take time, will probably get mired in controversy, and will likely attract many requests for additional emergency funding. We gave you a quick and easy path. You've chosen a much more difficult one that will only slow the response to Zika. I'm sorry you didn't take our advice and our permission to use those funds for Ebola and the other diseases for this immediate pending problem with Zika. Look forward to discussing these issues with you further during the question and answer part of the hearing, and I want to thank you for being here and for your work. Yield back.
Thank you. And now, Director Donovan, we'll turn to you for your testimony. If you could keep it in the 5-minute range, that'll allow more time for questions, and your full statement will be made a part of the record. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Chairman Rogers, thank you for joining us today. Chairman Crenshaw, Ranking Member Serrano, and all the members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to present the President's 2017 budget request for the Office of Management and Budget. I want to first thank this subcommittee and the full committee for its work on the 2016 Omnibus and the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015. Together, we came together to avoid harmful sequestration cuts and enacted a spending bill that provided critical funding for both our defense and non-defense priorities. The President's 2017 budget builds off the achievements we secured for 2016 and adheres to the funding levels authorized in the BBA. And we look forward to working with Congress to continue the progress we've made in moving the appropriations process back to regular order. I also want to thank you for your support of OMB. Over the last 3 years, you've provided OMB with resources to halt the furloughs and staffing losses that threatened our ability to maintain the high standard of quality that we hold ourselves to and that Congress rightly expects from OMB. Restoring capacity allows us to deliver more value for taxpayers through improved program management, smarter regulations, and more identified opportunities for savings. Under the President's leadership, we've turned around our economy and created 14 million jobs. The unemployment rate has fallen below 5% for the first time in almost 8 years. Nearly 18 million people have gained health coverage as the ACA has taken effect. And we've dramatically cut our deficits by almost 3/4. The President's 2017 budget will help continue this economic and fiscal progress. It shows that investments in growth and opportunity are compatible with putting the nation's finances on a strong and sustainable path. And it lifts sequestration in future years so that we continue to invest in our economic future and our national security, and replaces the savings by closing tax loopholes, reforming tax expenditures, and with smart spending reforms. The budget shows that the President and our administration remain focused on meeting our greatest challenges, not only for the year ahead, but for decades to come, making critical investments that will accelerate the pace of innovation, give everyone a fair shot at opportunity and economic security, and advance our national security and global leadership. The President's request for OMB is $100.7 million, which will be used to support the staff we brought on board in 2015 to address our historically low staffing levels, as well as enable us to hire an additional 10 full-time equivalents. Our 2017 request supports the staffing levels we need to more effectively oversee program management and funding, including identifying opportunities for budgetary savings across more than 100 agencies and departments throughout the federal government. OMB's request will also enable us to continue to play a central role in executing the President's management agenda. The additional resources will let OMB ramp up promising efforts and build on progress in a number of key areas. But I'd like to specifically highlight our investments in supporting smarter IT delivery and stronger cybersecurity across government. OMB is requesting $35 million for Information Technology Oversight and Reform, or ITOR, to support the use of data, analytics, and digital services to improve the effectiveness and security of government services. The requested resources will help scale up particularly promising efforts like the U.S. Digital Service, which has already saved agencies millions of dollars and assisted with many of our toughest digital challenges. The 2017 request expands the central USDS team at OMB to work on additional projects and supports standing up digital service teams at 25 agencies across the government. The ITOR fund also supports OMB's work on enhancing federal cybersecurity. Strengthening the cybersecurity of federal networks, systems, and data is one of the most important challenges we face as a nation. To address these challenges, the President created a Cybersecurity National Action Plan that takes near-term actions and puts in place a long-term strategy to enhance cybersecurity awareness and protections. OMB will use ITOR resources to work with federal agencies to implement these actions and to support timely and effective responses to cyber incidents. Our efforts to help deliver a smarter, more innovative, and more accountable government extend to our regular welfare and safety of Americans. We continue to make significant progress on the retrospective review of existing regulations, eliminating and streamlining regulations to reduce burden and cost. Since 2010, agency retrospective reviews have detailed hundreds of initiatives that will reduce costs, saving more than $22 billion in the near term. The responsibilities I've described here, in addition to our work with agencies to prepare and execute the federal budget. And while some people think only about OMB's efforts on behalf of the President's budget, members of this subcommittee know that OMB works with Congress every day to provide information and analysis and to respond to contingencies and unforeseen circumstances. I want to close by thanking you again for the opportunity to testify today. It's a particular honor for me to serve at OMB, given the critical role it plays and the talented individuals who work there. Supporting OMB and the work we do to make government perform better for the American public will continue to be a smart and necessary investment, and I look forward to continuing to work closely with this subcommittee to that end. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you. Let me ask you about your request, your budget request, a little over $100 million. You got an increase last year. You're asking for a 6% increase this year. And as I understand it, your role is to kind of say to the agencies what you ought to be asking money for and not spending. I mean, you oversee the overall budget. And that's why I said earlier, I think you have a particular responsibility in terms of fiscal restraint. I know when I was chairman of the legislative branch subcommittee of this full committee, I cut the members' office accounts by 10%. It was a tough decision, but I thought we ought to lead by example. And I think if you look over the last 5 years, the budget of the House of Representatives has gone down by 16% over the last 5 years. And so when you ask for 6% increase, as I look at the request, I think last year, part of that increase was going to go for 25 new staffers, and then for 17, another 10 new staff positions. Can you tell me, like, how many of the 25 from last year's appropriations have been hired?
We have fully hired to the staffing levels that you've provided in prior years. And I think it's important to recognize there's a significant piece of this, of the $5.7 million increase. $2.4 million will go just to inflationary increases that we have, whether staff, benefits, rent, those types of things. I think it's critical for us to execute the additional responsibilities that we've been given, many of them by statute. I was very pleased that we reached a bipartisan agreement in the transportation bill last year, for example, to step up our efforts to streamline infrastructure permitting across the country. I think a very strong bipartisan effort there. We are bringing on some new staff to implement that effort. That's a good example.
So the 25 that we funded last year, they've all been hired?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
And then you need 10 more for next year, and you got roles for them to play.
Absolutely. And again, many of those, the Data Act is another good example. But the chance, we've saved $3.5 billion in IT acquisition costs through the reforms that we've made. So the leverage on these staff, we think, and it's important that we show you the return on investment for those staff.
Gotcha. Let me ask you a quick question about some of the work you do when you oversee all the different regulations that come before you. And particularly, I mentioned in my opening statement the Department of Labor and the fiduciary standard. And as you know, we had this conversation last year where I believe the SEC, which we oversee and fund here, they have the primary responsibility to look at our economy and make sure that things are safe and stable. And it seems like they'd be the appropriate people to make a rule or regulation about fiduciary standards. And in fact, when we asked Mary Jo White at the hearing, she said they're working on a rule to do that. It seems like the Department of Labor has kind of just ignored everybody's input to say, you know, let's don't duplicate, let's don't make things overlap, and yet they just keep going. They've heard from the Department of Treasury, they've heard from the different appropriators, different subcommittees, full committees, and I guess the question is, if they're just going to kind of keep moving, then they come to you, and you got to ultimately review that. And my understanding is that you're going to expedite that review, and there might be a final rule sometime in April. And so the question becomes, do you sit down and do a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis to make sure that we all want to help investors? We all understand that the stock market is basically, there's certain risks involved. So we want to help, but we don't want to help in a way that cuts off people's access to investment advice. So do you, before you kind of finalize that rule, do you do a cost-benefit analysis?
Absolutely. And let me just say at the outset, we do have, as you just noted, this rule under review at this point. So I'm limited in what I can say on the specifics of the rule, but generally speaking, it's one of our most important duties is to ensure that cost-benefit analysis is done correctly and effectively, and we take the time necessary to ensure that that is done. One of our also one of our most important duties is to ensure that there is interagency review of regulations. In this case, it is the Department of Labor's statutory authorities that they're putting into effect through the rule, but we are one of our jobs is to make sure that there is a strong interagency review of these rules before they're finalized.
So can you assure us that there's not going to be duplication or inconsistencies if you have a rule by the SEC and a rule by the Department of Labor?
What I can assure you is that we're going to do everything we can to minimize those. SEC is obviously an independent agency, so while we consult with them, we don't have direct oversight over their rulemaking. But I can assure you that we will do everything we can to ensure that coordination.
And how do you go about making sure this proposed rule isn't going to have an unintended consequence, actually limit people's access, not adversely affect particularly some of the low and middle income Americans? How do you go about the process to make that determination?
Well, one of the critical things that we do, and this is through an open, transparent process of meetings and comments that come into rules. I believe there were thousands of comments that were received and evaluated, hundreds of meetings that took place in the review of the rule. And so that's obviously the best possible way to have an open, transparent process that makes sure that concerns about any particular rule are incorporated.
And I guess you know there have been a lot of concerns. Anytime you have a comment period, some people like it, some people don't, but there have been a lot of concerns raised, and not on a partisan basis, kind of across the board. People are just concerned that you don't overdo the regulation to really harm the people you're trying to help. So I just hope that you'll continue to keep that in mind. And again, when we have the SEC chairman before us, we'll ask her how she's doing on her rule, because again, we don't want to see the inconsistencies, duplication that just create even more confusion.
Well, again, I'm not going to comment directly on the rule. I will say that Secretary Perez has made clear they're doing everything they can to streamline and simplify the rule while still maintaining the bedrock principle of a fair standard of protection for investors.
Can you tell us whether or not you're expediting the rule and when the final rule might be available, or is that something you're not supposed to comment on?
Even if I could tell you, I wouldn't know exactly when we would be finished here. What I can tell you is we're giving it a full interagency review as I described.
Thank you very much. Mr. Serrano?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've touched on it somewhat, but I want you to expand on it. You know, we've been in a certain kind of mood in the last few years, actually more than a few years, of cutting the budget. And some members feel that if we cut the budget, that's fine, that's what we were elected to do. But some of us feel that what made our country great was investing in our country also, investing in infrastructure, investing in education. So how does the president's budget deal with those issues? And is it possible, do you think, at all in this climate, and I know this is more a political question than anything else, for any president to make Congress happy in terms of investing and at the same time not making them totally angry on spending?
Well, I think you've hit on a core issue that we grappled with in the budget, but I will say that I think what we really did here was to build on a bipartisan precedent that we've seen now twice with the Murray-Ryan Agreement and then with the Bipartisan Budget Act last year. And that is basically to recognize that sequestration, which I would really describe in many cases as mindless austerity, kind of cutting just simply straight across a budget without reflecting really which are the critical investments, that on a bipartisan basis we came together last year to invest more on the discretionary side of the budget, but we offset it with both revenue increases and smart spending cuts on the mandatory side of the budget. And that's exactly the model that we have been taking up in the president's budget. Not only are we living within the caps that were part of that budget deal, which provide substantial relief on the discretionary side for critical investments, that yes, many of which you described, but we also achieved $2.9 trillion in deficit reduction over the 10-year window through taking a look at where we can close loopholes on the tax side, where we can make smart spending reductions. We have $375 billion in healthcare savings over the 10-year window. So we really think that's the right model, and it's a model that's been bipartisan that we've followed. But what we can't do is continue to cut the very things that will help us make the investments that are going to grow our economy, whether it's the research and development that's so critical to keeping our innovation edge that we have over other countries, whether it's investing from the very youngest age in our kids, like we did with Head Start in the bipartisan agreement last year, and we continue this year in our budget, in education and training and so many other areas that are critical to our short-term but also our long-term success.
I'm glad that we're discussing that approach, Mr. Chairman, because one of my concerns, and the way I always say it is, you know, somewhere right now in this country, in many places, there's a man and a woman somewhere in a lab, or a couple of men and women in a lab in white coats, working either on the next Velcro or perhaps finding a cure for cancer or the common cold. And we sometimes feel, it looks to me, like we're willing to even cut those areas, you know, that make us grow. Do you think we're reaching at all that dangerous point, or do you think that the bipartisan agreements we've had, or some of the changing in tone that we've seen at times in the last couple of years, which some people forget about, that it hasn't all been rancor and discord at times, that we can get to a point where we don't jeopardize the investments we have to make in the future of the country?
Well, I'm hopeful if we can continue not the model that we had of 3 or 4 years ago between shutdown and the other manufactured crises that really hurt our economy, hurt confidence of individual families across the country and our businesses, but follow the model we had last fall I think we really can make progress on these issues, because I think there's broad recognition that discretionary spending is not where our fiscal challenges are, that actually we're investing too little on the discretionary side, even with the substantial increase that we got in this budget deal, which we lived by in our budget, and that really where our fiscal challenges are more on the revenue and on the mandatory side of the budget, particularly around healthcare. And that's something that we've made a lot of progress on, is bringing down our healthcare costs.
Mr. Chairman, one quick question. And this is a question that I run the risk that anybody under 30 in the audience will leave here shaking their head and saying, how dumb can he be? But can we reach a point where the IT equipment we buy doesn't become obsolete 6 months later? Is that our ability to purchase improperly, or is it just that technology changes so quickly that we can't keep up?
Well,
Because it seems that if all the years I've been on appropriations, I mean, there was the FY 2000 where we thought we were going to all die and then the country was going to go down the drain. But since then, one of the issues is how we pour money at times, honestly, hearing a Democrat say that, into IT, and then a year later, the department or that agency saying it's obsolete.
Yep.
Is there any way to deal with that?
Part of this is clearly technology changes quickly, but the fact is, historically, the government has taken an approach that dramatically exacerbated that problem. A lot of this is in how we procure information technology. And whether that's the individual devices that we use or how we procure software services. And so two critical things that we're doing that we're making a great deal of progress on. One is we're moving aggressively to what we call category management. Instead of having literally thousands of different contracts across the federal government for laptops, for desktops, for handheld devices, we're going to a very small number of government-wide contracts. As we started to implement that late last year in IT, and particularly in devices, we saw a 50% decline in prices very quickly. How can that be, you say? Because, for example, right now, if you're going to bid on a contract, you've got to look at potentially thousands of different contracts in different agencies with many, many different types of configurations. Instead, if we go to saying simply, let's choose 3, 4, 5 different configurations of a desktop or a laptop and make that the standard, we can actually dramatically improve the efficiency for the contractors themselves of doing business with us and bring the prices down, and we've started to see that. On software procurement, which is a little more complicated, we've moved to what we call an agile system. It basically used to be that we would buy giant IT systems all at once, kind of in a big bang, and by the time you get 4 years down the road, realize you're above budget, behind schedule, it's too late to be able to make changes and adjustments. Instead, what we're doing is buying, just like the private sector does, much more incrementally. And that is also really starting to make a difference. I saw this, frankly, at HUD. When I came in, I had a giant financial services project that was above budget, behind schedule. And I came to OMB. This is the role that OMB can play. I came to OMB. They said, you know what? Treasury's actually got a system that's very similar. And so we moved to what we call shared services, where HUD now does all its financial transactions through this system at Treasury. Much more cost effective. And so those are the kind of techniques that even if technology changes quickly, it allows us to be much more agile and responsive to keep up with those changes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just real quick, do you have a number, like how much money the federal government spends every year across the board on IT?
Roughly $90 billion.
That's all? Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Director, let's talk about debt. We owe over $19 trillion, growing uncontrollably. Several trillions of it during this administration. People out there are frightened, frustrated, mad. misunderstanding of what's happening. And when I try to tell them, look, we've cut spending. In discretionary spending, we've cut, in the last 5 years, over $195 billion. And yet the debt continues to zoom. Why? Because of mandatory spending, entitlement spending. Out of control. When I first came here, we appropriated 2/3 of federal spending. Today it's 1/3. 2/3 is now mandatory, automatic. If you qualify for a certain program, the money comes out of the Treasury. Doesn't go through this committee. We have no oversight. If we continue this pace, as I said in my opening statement, soon the debt interest is going to exceed what we spend for national defense, among other things. So it's a real crisis, my judgment. Of the $4 trillion in federal spending that's going to take place next year, we're only appropriating $100 billion. And it's out of control. And yet, this budget that the administration is proposing would increase mandatory funding by some $60 billion, either currently funded under discretionary or new money that should be funded as discretionary. Knowing that we've got a mandatory spending problem that's crowding everything else out, the president chooses to ignore that problem and, frankly, only make it worse. He plans to pay for much of this new funding through imaginary fees and taxes that obviously aren't going to happen. With the president having been in office now over 7 years, we still haven't seen a credible plan to tackle this out-of-control entitlement spending and debt. He has almost 11 months left in office. Can we see any hope that he will make a good faith effort with the Congress to help strengthen and preserve critical entitlement programs, and yet have some kind of check on the rapid growth of the entitlement sector?
So, Chairman, let me begin by agreeing with your fundamental premise that discretionary spending is actually a place that we've cut, and I think cut too far, and that was the basis of the bipartisan deal we reached last year. And I want to thank you for your leadership on getting to, I thought, a very effective compromise on the omnibus at the end of last year. Where I want to disagree with you is that, in fact, since the president has come into office, we have made substantial progress, not just on our short-run deficits, which are down by roughly 75%. We've had the fastest sustained deficit reduction since the end of World War II. But we have also made substantial progress on our medium and long-run deficit and debt as well. And the reason for that is because healthcare spending, as you know, is the single most important challenge that we have on the mandatory spending side. It outweighs all other programs. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why the president immediately on coming into office focused on this issue. And since he came into office, we've actually seen the slowest healthcare cost growth in 50 years. And in fact, if you just take 1 year, the year 2020, since the Affordable Care Act was passed, CBO, these are not our numbers, CBO projects that we're going to spend $185 billion less in 2020 on Medicare and Medicaid combined. So we have made real progress. And what we're proposing in our budget is to continue that progress. We have $375 billion of further healthcare savings that we're proposing. And as we saw with the DocFix legislation that got done about a year ago, we think there are many areas where we can make bipartisan progress to make further progress on those entitlements. But I would also say that the president believes that we need to take a balanced approach. And the fact is we have
order. Most of us were optimistic that this year's appropriations process would be smoother than the prior years. Yet, Speaker Ryan, I understand, is entertaining cutting entitlements through appropriation bills instead of through authorizing committees. And Budget Committee Republicans broke with decorum and did not invite you to testify on the president's budget request. This is very surprising to me. At this time, it's unclear whether House Republicans will even offer a budget of their own. At least the Appropriations Committee is doing its job. And I'm very happy to work with the chairman in doing the job, and I am glad to have you here today.
Thank you.
Director Donovan, do you know the last time a sitting OMB director was not asked to testify before the Budget Committee?
To my knowledge, Ranking Member, that has never happened before since the budget committees were created. And I will say, despite any personal feelings, I think the most important issue is that I was disappointed because we did make, and I said this before you arrived, and I want to compliment you directly for the bipartisan work, both on the bipartisan budget agreement and on the omnibus in December. But it felt like we made a lot of progress toward reestablishing regular order in doing that and creating this two-year framework and getting a good agreement, a good compromise last year. And I was disappointed that I wasn't able to testify. My hope is that we can continue the progress toward regular order as we go forward.
And I know because Chairman Rogers and I would like to have regular order and move forward with regular order. So, Mr. Donovan, Mr. Director, had you been invited to testify before the Budget Committee, are there particular areas of federal investment that would spur the economy, enhance our national security, provide groundbreaking biomedical breakthroughs that you would have discussed? If so, I'm happy to let you speak to those investments now.
Thank you. I would really highlight three key areas, and these were areas that the President highlighted as major challenges for the country going forward. First, we have to invest to maintain our leadership as the most innovative economy on earth. And one particular area that he highlighted was the investment in renewable energy. R&D for that is a critical place where we can put people to work, grow the jobs of the future. But an area that I know is near and dear to your heart as well is on biomedical research and a substantial increase in investment that we're proposing as part of the Cancer Moonshot, along with a range of other areas of investment as well. The second big area is where we need to invest to grow opportunity, to give everybody a fair shot in the country. One of the most important advances I think we won in the omnibus was a major increase in Head Start to get kids started at the very earliest stages. Our budget proposes more than $400 million increase there, which would take us to more than half of Head Start programs full day, full year around the country, which has been shown to be a critical advance. But also a great bipartisan victory in the replacing the No Child Left Behind Act. And I think there's a significant set of places that we could invest and that the budget does on the education side, on training and apprenticeships. One other area that I would point out to really try to modernize the safety net that we have for workers is our wage insurance proposal as part of a broader effort to modernize unemployment insurance around the country. We think that's a critical area where we could make bipartisan progress, encourage people to get back to work even more quickly. So those are two. And then the third is national security. The budget invests more than $2 billion in additional resources to take the fight to ISIL, substantial increases to make sure that our European partners are reassured that we are going to stand in the way of Russia's aggressive actions in Europe and beyond. Third, the cybersecurity proposal that we've already started to talk about is a major national security threat that we need to do more on, and the budget proposes a more than 1/3 increase, $19 billion in total, for our fight to improve cybersecurity.
In looking at President Obama's final budget proposal, I see that it would reduce the federal deficit to $503 billion in fiscal 2017, down from the current fiscal year. In fact, since 2009, under President Obama's leadership, federal deficits have fallen by nearly 3/4, the most rapid sustained deficit reduction just after World War II. The annual deficit in 2015 fell to 2.5% of the gross domestic product, the lowest level since 2007, and well below the average of the last 40 years. You've mentioned that the budget stays within last year's budget agreement and as a result has caused some tough choices. Can you describe the effect of some of these choices on the discretionary side of the budget?
Absolutely. So the structure of the bipartisan budget agreement relieved about 90% of sequester on the non-defense side of the budget, but only about 60% in 2017. So 90% in 2016, about 60% in 2017. Essentially, discretionary funding is about flat from in our budget from 2016. And what that means is, as you well know, if you look at areas like veterans health care, where there are inflationary increases that happen each year, Section 8 vouchers I'm very familiar with, and a range of other programs where simply serving the same number of people requires an inflationary increase. What that means is when you have flat funding, you're going to have much more pressure on other discretionary accounts. And so there are a range of areas where we had to make tough decisions, whether it's in low-income heating assistance, the LIHEAP program, CDBG, state paid leave assistance. There are a number of areas where we would have wanted to do more, but through the compromise that was reached, we decided that we should honor the deal that was reached last year and stick to those caps despite those tough choices.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time.
Now we'll turn to Mr. Womack.
Thank you. I want to pick up, before I go to a couple of my prepared questions, I want to go back and pick up on Chairman Rogers' discussion on the mandatory side. So since we didn't have a presentation, Director Donovan, before the Budget Committee, on which I proudly serve, maybe we could go back and just revisit some numbers in response to his questions. One, what does the gross federal debt of the U.S. government balloon to in the 10-year window?
Actually, it declines from about 76% of GDP.
So let me
down
stop you
to-
for just a minute.
It declines
I've
over
got
the
very
10-year
limited
window.
time. I got very limited time, Director. So only in Washington, and only from the Office of Management and Budget, could we see the gross federal debt go from $19 trillion today to, and let me help you with the number, it's fresh on my mind, even with $3 trillion worth of tax increases, $26 trillion in the 10-year window. Now forget the percentage of the economy. That's in many respects, that's kind of a fairy tale around here. But only here can we go from $19 trillion in gross federal debt to $26 trillion, and somebody in this administration talk about how it's going down. So let me ask you this. What is the net interest on the debt based on the projections of interest rates, if there is such a thing over the 10-year window? Today, it's in round numbers $225 or $30 billion a year. So what does it go to in the 10-year window, Mr. Director?
I don't have those numbers in front of me.
Well, let me help you with the number. Even with tax increases, it balloons to more than $700 billion a year. What do we spend on national defense?
with OCO, 500 and some odd billion plus some OCO money. So let's just round it to $600 billion. In the budget that was presented to this Congress by this president, we were going to take the net interest on the debt from an alarming rate of $225 or $30 billion today to nearly $800 billion in the 10-year window. And if you take out tax increases, it's nearly a $1 trillion of interest. How can you sit here with a straight face and tell this committee, in response to questions about what we know to be the true drivers of the deficits and the debt in this country, mandatory spending, that this president has done anything but lead on how we're going to get our arms around this phenomenon? How can you sit here and say
Congressman, you don't have to take my word for it. If you look at CBO's numbers, if you look at the
these are CBO's numbers I'm looking at.
And CBO's numbers will show you that relative to where we were 4 or 5 years ago, they will tell you we expect to spend $185 billion less on Medicare and Medicaid in 2020 than we did just 4 or 5 years ago. Relative to current law, our budget shows $2.9 trillion of deficit reduction. And so we are making real progress on the most important driver of mandatory spending. We have the lowest healthcare cost growth that we've had in 50 years. And that is why, despite the politics around the Affordable Care Act, the president focused on healthcare as one of the most important drivers, if not the most important, of our mandatory challenges. And we have made real progress on that front.
All right, I'm glad you mentioned health care because I agree with you that it's the principal driver of the deficits and the debt as we now know it. So at about what year, and I know you've looked at these numbers, at about what year, based on 18% of GDP in average revenues, that's about what we see, 18 plus or minus, at what year is there no money left for discretionary spending at all? No money at all for this committee to appropriate. At what year does that happen? Because mandatory programs consume all of it.
Right. Congressman, one of the things that we all have to recognize,
what year?
Leave aside the politics,
what year?
Is that we have a demographic challenge in this country with the retirement of the baby boomers that is going to require us to pay attention to these mandatory challenges, but also to look at the revenue side. If we want to keep our promises to seniors, we are going to have to look not just
to raise a lot of taxes. What I find incomprehensible as a member of Congress, because I sat with my colleagues on the floor of that House when the President gave his State of the Union address and talked for 70 minutes, and not one time did he dedicate any leadership from that podium on what we're going to try to do to get our arms around the mandatory spending that is bankrupting this country. That's the kind of leadership that I think we should expect out of the President, and that's leadership that I think is lacking in the budget proposal.
What I can certainly tell you is he showed a lot of leadership in pushing healthcare reform that is accelerating the cost reductions that we've seen, that all the it is universally recognized in the last 4 to 5 years. So I think it is a completely unfair characterization that we have not focused on entitlements, and in fact, we've made remarkable progress compared to any benchmark when the President came in.
Probably not going to agree on that one, but now yield back my time.
Thank you. We'll have time for another round of questions, but now let's turn to Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I can't help it. I wasn't going to get into this, but let me put this on a different picture and put it in the proper perspective. Simpson Bowles, I believe, really only had one major vote on the House side, and that was Cooper LaTourette, as I recall. And I was one of 38 members of the House to vote for that. So the debt, the deficit, these are things I'm concerned about and put my vote on the line toward that in. But let me just put the perspective. I think what you're trying to get to is, as you relate to the deficit as it relates to GDP, I think what you're saying is if a household of $25,000 annual income has $5,000 in debt, that's a whole lot different. If there's a debt of $5,000 and it's a $50,000 income of the year, correct? Is this what you're alluding to?
This is the way we look at mortgages, we look at personal finances. What share of people's income do they dedicate toward their debt? And that's exactly the way we look at it for the economy.
And one last point on this, I'm sure you don't have this able to answer now, but since people are asking you for specific numbers, and if you don't have it, if the total debt we have right now, could you tell us what percentage of that debt comes from the Iraq War and the tax cuts that came with it at the same time?
I don't have an exact number. What I can tell you is a sizable portion when the president came into office. I would also say,
I'd like to know what percentage is.
well, that we've reduced spending in OCO, in the war account, by over $100 billion a year since the president came into office, because he was able to keep his promises to end the ground wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
And I appreciate that, but at some point, if you get to us the raw
Absolutely.
numbers of how much we owe now, how much of that now, and as time goes on, what percentage of that will be from the expenses of invading Iraq and completing that war, and the tax cuts that went. Because as I recall, in World War II, we went to war, and we recognized that wars are expensive, and we raised taxes. On a less pleasant note, let me talk about something locally in Illinois. Flooding is a regional issue. In the Chicagoland area, it's a bipartisan issue. I talked to my Republican colleagues and those that serve with me in the region. One of the big solutions to that was the McCook reservoirs, supported on a bipartisan basis, got funding from under the extraordinary mistaken belief that Stage 2 is related to water pollution control, instead of the fact that it's for flood control, fully authorized and documented in the Corps system as such. The project is being recommended by the Corps for flood protection. At some point, as Senator Durbin and I have been talking about, but again, on a bipartisan basis, we need your help to try to include these resources in the FY17 work plan for the Corps of Engineers in that area.
Well, I understand your concern about this. We did include...
Concern is you stub your toe. This is broken foot.
I'm sorry if I understated it.
Yeah.
But we did include $5 million in the 2016 work plan, which is part of a substantial contribution we made to completing Phase 1. I am glad that we are able to keep that commitment to the first phase, but I understand that you're focused on how we get Phase 2 funded.
Right. So this will be one of many conversations and more animated, because with all due respect, we need your help to try to find a way to put these resources in the work plan for the Corps of Engineers. And I believe that Ms. Darcy will be around Friday, and we'll have an animated conversation with her at that time as well. But the fact is, we need your help. Funding the first 3 years and then leaving it hanging there isn't particularly helpful.
Understood.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Graves.
Mr. Donovan, good to see you.
And you?
I guess I'm going to change topics briefly for a moment, but first, I'm excited to hear the enthusiastic support of the President's budget by Mr. Quigley and the ranking member, and I hope to see them introduce that and put their name on it and co-sponsor it and advocate for it and debate it on the floor so we can see where all members of the House stand on that budget. But thinking about the President's budget, thinking about Mr. Womack's comments and the Chairman's comments, the American people, and particularly in the 14th District of Georgia, are just mad. They are frustrated. They do not trust this government. They do not trust any kind of responsibility with financial management, with reducing the debt. They hear the comments such as you just described of oh, well, the debt's going to go down over time in relation to something else, when actually the number is going up over time. They see that. They know that. And it's that frustration that is you're seeing all throughout the country right now in this presidential election. And quite frankly, I'm glad that they're expressing this frustration and this anger, because I'm hoping somebody will listen. And we're soon to find out who's going to be listening. But in an area where they know they can control and they know they can manage, that's their own personal finances. They don't think anybody can do anything with this place up here, and for the most part, I think they're right. But someplace where they do have direct control and access is their own personal finances, their own debt reduction, their own savings for retirement. And that leads me to the fiduciary rule that you and I spoke of much last year. And you mentioned it briefly today that about the economic analysis. And I know your terms you used earlier today were the same as last year in that you cannot speak directly on the rule because the rule is being evaluated. But as to the economic analysis, has there been one completed, the cost-benefit analysis? And if so, what did it indicate?
So the cost-benefit analysis is obviously completed as part of finalization of a rule, so we do not have a final cost-benefit analysis that I can speak to. What I can say is that the Council of Economic Advisors looked at this issue more broadly and identified that consumers lose about $17 billion a year over bad advice on investment products. So there clearly is a major impact directly to families, the families that you're talking about, from bad advice.
So the $17 billion, I believe that's the far end of the scale. It's a very wide range. It's an extremely wide range of a number. Is that an analysis that you're basing your economic analysis off of, or is yours an independent analysis and taking into consideration potentially other analysis that may disagree with the $17 billion or the $8 billion number?
Again, I can't speak directly to OIRAs because we have not completed the rulemaking, but generally speaking, we look at a broad range of sources of information, not just the Council of Economic Advisors.
Well, speaking of the one you did reference, so I assume you have knowledge of it. How does that $17 billion of saving, how is it achieved? How does a consumer achieve a savings?
Oh, I think it was a cost, and so the savings would be achieved if a consumer is protected from getting bad advice or gets better advice.
How, though? The mechanism of you say it's a cost, so if they don't incur that cost, I'm going to suggest it's a savings. How are they saving $17 billion specifically?
If they get, if I understand the question, it would be through getting advice that would allow them to make better investment decisions.
Is the assumption that there would be the same number of investors post-fiduciary rule versus pre-fiduciary rule in that analysis?
I guess I would want to look back at that analysis to before I answered that question. I'm not sure.
I understand. Well, my concern, and I'll close, Mr. Chairman, is that while this rule may have some intention, we don't know whether it's good or not intention. It has some intention. The question truly should be, how does this impact the overall consumer who in my district is working hard every day just to try to slog through this economy that the president and previous spending and irresponsibility has created for them to struggle through in their families. But they want to get ahead. They want a fair shot. They want to be able to save. They want to be able to invest. My concern is that this rule is a barrier to them, that instead of being able to save a little money and meet with somebody in their town that they know, that they go to church with, that they shop with, they see locally that offers them advice, now they're going to be pushed more towards an interface that's impersonal, and maybe it's a computer interface, internet interface, whatever it might be, but something that is less accessible, which creates a deterrent, which creates less savings and less preparation for retirement. So I'd be very interested in the analysis and whether or not it considers the assumption that you will have the same, if not more investors in the future after the rule, or will you have less investors? Because it's going to be one of those three options there. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think what he's asking is what areas of the market failure led the administration to propose this rule. I mean, think about that. It sounds like one of those solutions looking for a problem, but that's, you can think that through. Let's turn now to Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Donovan, welcome to the committee. Director, you're a good man. I like you. We've had conversations in the past, but your attempts to sugarcoat this budget and its projections for the future on behalf of the administration that I know you work for is just a sad abdication of responsibility for the challenges we're facing as a country. Chairman Rogers, my colleagues, Mr. Womack, Mr. Graves, and others have really laid out some very specific concerns, and what we've gotten into is a debate which we see all the time in Washington, D.C. about historical discussions about who was wrong and who was right, and we have real no optimism for where we're going for the future. So I want to take our conversation to what we can do to work together to solve some of these problems going forward, because where we're headed is not a rosy situation. Now, when you look at where we've come from at 10 trillion to 20 trillion, that's a huge deficit increase or huge debt increase, and no one gets a pat on the back for that. We know that if we had adopted every one of the president's budget, our budget would be 20%, our government would be 20% larger today. And so we know that that we have reduced a bad situation to not as bad as it could have been, and that may be the motto of what's going on in Washington these days, is things could be worse, but things need to get a whole lot better, and I know you know that, and I know that you know this budget doesn't really pass the smell test. You know, when you look at what's driving the cost, and we've had this discussion, sort of a straw man from the ranking member about mindless austerity, manufactured crisis. You both had that conversation. I mean, what the House has tried to do is try to really shed light on and be honest with the American people about where we're going. When you look at automatic spending, you look at the pie charts, you know, in 1965 it was 34%. In 2015 it's 68%. It's headed to 78%. Mr. Womack asked when it would be 100%. We don't know the answer to that, but it's really bad, and it's crowding out investment. So I really pushed hard in the last budget to increase the president's budget request on NIH from $1 billion got up to $2 billion. I sent a letter with a bunch of my colleagues, many folks here, to try to get to $3 billion. And we can't get there because the White House has other priorities or because we're being crowded out by mandatory spending. I have a 3-year-old daughter, a 2-year-old daughter, a 3-month-old daughter. We all have children, we all have grandchildren, people that we're worried about. And I guess my questions for you are, as we go forward, what do we tell them? And when can I tell my children, when can we tell our children that the American budget will be balanced if we adopt the president's budget submission?
Well, I guess I would disagree with you that I haven't been talking about forward-looking proposals here. I talked specifically about a broad set of things the president's budget does on healthcare reform. Let me take another.
I understand, Sean, Director. I just have a little bit of time here, and so I have some specific questions that I just want to get to the heart of, and we're going to get into a debate about semantics. And
what you could tell your daughter.
I know,
I'm trying to answer.
Right, I know, but I want to know just when can we tell our children that the American government will run in the black based upon the president's budget submission? It's a pretty simple question, and you're a very smart man. I know you know the answer to this. What's that date?
I think what you should tell your daughter is that this country is facing a significant demographic challenge with the retirement of the baby boom, that we need to keep our promises to those retirees.
Well, let's go to that question.
If I could just
Sure.
finish, you asked a question. One of the most important things about that is that we are now facing a world where instead of having over 3 workers for every retiree, we're going to have about 2.5.
I'm probably going to agree with you on a lot of the root causes, Director.
Immigration reform is actually an area where I think we could reach a bipartisan agreement. It will help us not only grow our economy, it would reduce the deficit by $1 trillion.
So my child asked me, when's the budget going to balance?
Social Security.
And I say what?
What I would tell her is that we need to do exactly the kinds of things that we're proposing to do.
So I wouldn't tell her. I would
Reduce
not
the
tell her.
cost.
What's the answer to the question, Director? When does the budget? When does America
trying to
run a
answer
budget
you.
in the black? I know, but when's your projection? Give me a date. When will the American budget be in the black again? Based upon the president's budget request, which lays out all of his requests. This is his vision for the future. It's your vision for the future. On what date certain can we tell the American people, if we adopt your policies wholeheartedly, the $3.5 trillion in tax increases, if we adopt all of that, because you've already asked for trillions in new taxes, we adopt it as is. When is the black? When we go in the black?
Please don't mischaracterize our budget. We propose a budget that has $2.9 trillion in deficit reduction, that in the 10-year window stabilizes debt and starts to bring it down compared to a current path that we're on where debt would increase substantially as a share of the economy. Those are the critical tests that the president's laid out for fiscal stability, and we meet those tests.
Mr. Chairman, I'll submit to the director, who I have a lot of respect for. This is why people get frustrated with Washington, because we can't ever get straight answers to straight questions. I have other questions on here in terms of Medicare. You mentioned that. When are IPAB cuts going to start with Medicare? Because the CMS says next year. Is that still your position, that the way to fix retirement benefits through Obamacare that you're talking about so much as the key to these healthcare situations, that what's the date certain when I can tell my 104-year-old grandmother that her Medicare benefits would be cut under the IPAB?
Well, first of all, CMS will make a final decision this year, but you're also deeply mischaracterizing the way the IPAB works. All of those changes are presented to Congress and voted on by Congress. And so
when will the IPAB, when will the government, when will CMS make recommendations, and how much will they be regarding how much of Medicare cuts?
Later this year, in the next few months.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just conclude by saying this is why I think Americans are frustrated that we can't get straight answers to these questions. We're not making the kind of progress we need to make. We're leaving a legacy of debt and despair for the next generation. Director Donovan knows it. The president knows it. And they're shutting down and going to be gone in a year. And we're going to be here left with fixing the situation. And our kids and grandkids, ultimately, after Director Donovan's gone and I'm gone, we both know they're going to be left picking up this leftover expense. And it's embarrassing, and we ought to work together to seriously fix it and not get into semantical debate about shaving off of increases, and we were going to build something and we didn't build it, so we're going to count that as a cut. It's a lot of Washington talk, and we all know how this works. The reality is the debt is growing to an unsustainable level, and we're going to saddle our kids and grandkids with it. And I just hope and pray that this administration, the president's got political capital left, that maybe he'll come to the table and we can actually work together so we can answer that question. This is the date certain, we will go in the black, and this is when we'll actually solve this problem. And until then, we're going to have these conversations that ultimately get us nowhere. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now we'll turn to Mr. Ridgel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Donovan. I thank you for being here today, and I want to give you credit right from the start. I think you're trying to do the best you can. Okay. That said, the differences between your assessment of our situation and indeed the president's assessment of our situation and my own and what I see in my colleagues, the differences are profound and they're fundamental. I had the opportunity to meet with the president, it was a few years ago, and it was just for a few minutes. But in those few minutes that I had the opportunity to speak to him, I went right at this issue of our fiscal situation. Above all else, it's what concerns me, and I just associate myself with the remarks of my colleagues. We didn't meet beforehand to understand where we were coming from on a line of questioning. But it resonates with me, the alarm that they're expressing. Our nation, and in the nation's capital, I think hyperbole is used oftentimes, and the word crisis is used on just about everything. But I'm submitting to you that we do indeed have a fiscal crisis. I don't believe that your testimony here today reflects the crisis we're in. I don't think the president's words reflect the crisis that we're in. In fact, I associate myself with what Mr. Womack said. I walked out of the State of the Union and I just thought, it's like he's just completely unaware of where we're headed financially. Interest rates can only go one way, right? Which way? Up. $130 billion for each 100 basis points, one full point increase. That's hardly reflected in all of this. I look at the president's schedule, what he talks about, and when he's in public, it's like fiscal Orwellian speak. You know, I've been a business person all of my life and dealt with budgets, and I look at your own testimony, Mr. Donovan. Look, page 1, bottom paragraph, and I know you know the difference between the debt and the deficit, but listen to this sentence. The 2017 budget continues this progress. It shows, okay, you talk about that we are proud of the president's budget, that it meets the test of fiscal sustainability. Listen to this part. And putting debt on a declining path through 2025. Does the president's budget put debt on a declining path through 2025?
Yes, it does.
No, it does not. As a percent of the GDP, it does. And by the way, I agree with you on that point. Everything ought to be evaluated in terms of percent of GDP. Revenue, expenditures, the debt as a percent of GDP. But words matter, Mr. Donovan. I'd expect that you, of all people, would understand the difference here. You said you're putting the debt on a declining balance through 2025.
A declining path as a share of the economy?
No, debt is increasing. We need to be precise.
As a share of the economy.
Oh, is that what you're,
declines
that's
through
not
the
what it said here. Look, this isn't a matter of semantics. I get the difference. Listen, I'm in favor of evaluating things as a percent of GDP.
Every serious economist who looks at this issue
Now,
looks
you're
at debt
misunderstanding
and
what
deficits
the point
as a
I'm making.
share of the economy.
No, on that point, Mr. Donovan, please, you're a smart guy. I'm not trying to talk down to you. I think we're trying, the thing is we only have 5 minutes. It goes just like that. On that point, I'm in agreement with you. I really believe everything ought to be evaluated as a percent of GDP. That's how every lender does this. This is how I ran my business. It's your ability to repay, and that is a percent of whatever it is, your business cash flow or whatever. On that point, we're in agreement. I'm saying that even in your written testimony, you said we're putting debt on a declining path. Now, if I was putting my business on a path of declining debt, that means I'm paying down my debt. The reason I bring this to your attention is because when I hear the president speak, and indeed it's kind of embedded in your own testimony here, it is a bit Orwellian. And what I mean by that is that you're not dealing with reality, the stark and harsh and troubling reality of our fiscal situation. The president references an extremist point of deficits, and he says, I brought them down. Well, he doesn't go on to say, but they're still way too high. That's what leadership is. And look,
deficits today are below the 40-year average of deficits.
Well, no, see, the challenge that, see, this Orwellian speak here, and look, I still associate myself, there's a fundamental difference between this side and that side. And frankly, we're right on this. We are calling attention to our fiscal situation. You're not expressing any real concern about where we're headed. I tell you.
I don't think that's accurate. I've talked a lot about the progress that we've made, but also more that we need to do.
The president's not fighting for this. He's not fighting. He didn't say hardly a word about it in the State of the Union speech. Hardly a word. That is not leadership. The clock's ticking on his administration. The clock's ticking on our country. No, I'm sorry. Listen, I don't mean to raise my voice, and I appreciate the ranking member. No, he's. I've been on this committee a long, long time, and I've never seen anyone come before us treat it the way.
And the last time I read the Constitution and the Appropriations Committee manuals. It says that the president proposes and we dispose. So how can it be that a president is driving up the debt when we pass bills that pay for programs in this country? So we don't have a dictatorship, and I think it's time we realize we don't have a dictatorship. We're either all guilty or no one is guilty.
Mr. Chairman, may I just have 30 seconds?
Certainly, that doesn't count against your time.
Okay.
And if you feel like talking loud, that's why I don't think the director
and I just I thank the ranking
I can talk
member,
loud too.
and I respect the ranking member. And look, it's an honor to be on this committee. And I simply want to say, look, we're fellow Americans trying to get this right. And I've got problems with my own party. The Americans for Tax Reform pledge is mathematically indefensible. I'm simply submitting to you, Mr. Donovan, that part of leadership, and I think the fundamental part of it, is a proper assessment of the current situation and the trajectory, the direction we're going. My concern here today is not something I've contrived. I know these hearings are so often thought of as theater. I'm not saying I care any more than you about our fiscal situation, but it keeps me up at night, and frankly, I wish it didn't. I didn't think about this as much as I do. But when we get on the flip side of debt, and we're there, 200 basis points, 2 full interest, 2 points going up, which is frankly within reason, $260 billion. And to the ranking member's point, my own party's contributed to this situation. I didn't like it when I was told to go out shopping when we got into wars. I wanted somebody to tell me how I needed to sacrifice. I never heard that. But I've taken enough time, and I thank the chairman for his extension of time, and I thank the ranking member for his comment. And I thank you for your testimony today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just for the record, Mr. Ridgel always talks pretty loud, so I'm not sure that
And I'm from New York, so I'm okay.
we'll have time. We'll have time. I hope y'all stick around. We'll have another round of questions, but let me interrupt that for a second. But I will say, as I said in my opening statement, Director, people look and they see it took 233 years to get to the point where we're $10 trillion. That's our national debt. And then they can look and see the last 8 years, we added $10 trillion to our debt. I mean, those are things that people understand, and I think we're all trying to figure out a way to. That's not a good place to be. But let me ask you two quick questions about just kind of the budget. As I mentioned in my opening statement, you cut the Corps of Engineers by 22%, and as I pointed out too, that most of the cargo internationally goes through our ports. You got these post-Panamax ships, they're bigger, they draw more, and so our ports need to deepen their waterways to compete internationally. And so I guess the question is why did the administration, why are you proposing a 22% reduction over the Army Corps' last year's budget, and why is there a reduction of $800 million, or about 40%, for these constructions accounts? And those are the ones that fund our ports. So could you tell us what went into your thinking?
Look, this is, I think it was Ranking Member Lowy asked earlier about tough decisions we had to make in the budget. Given that it was basically flat from 2016, there were a series of places where we needed to find reductions, and this was one of the places that we went. On the construction point, the operations and maintenance account for the Corps is more fixed, if you will, because they've got to take care of a set of assets that are there. So it tends to be the construction account that suffers the most in those cases. So this is something where you and I have met a number of times about Jacksonville and the focus on it. We were able to get to 6 new starts in 2016, which was an unusually high level, and we've allocated those to the highest return projects. But as you well know, there are far more projects, and our hope is that not only we can do more directly, but we're also working, as you and I have discussed, on ways to make sure that private resources are coming in and supporting the construction of those. That we think there's a lot of opportunity, given exactly the competitive advantage that you've talked about post-Panamax, that there's a lot of way to bring private capital into these projects as well. And
so the one new start this year, 6 last year, 1 this year, just kind of a matter of priority in terms of not enough money to go around? Is that?
That was the single most important.
What are the criteria? What do you look at when you decide what makes a new start? What do you look for? Like on that one new start, you suggest what went into your thinking to make that decision?
Really, it's working with the Army Corps. It's cost-benefit analysis. So in every case, the traditional starts that we did were over 2.5 cost-benefit ratio. So actually 2.5 benefits to cost. And so they showed a dramatically high level of return relative to other projects.
Gotcha. And switching gears real quick, some agencies of the federal government get funded through mandatory appropriations. They're not subject to review by the full appropriations committee, like I guess the OCC and this new agency, the CFPB. And I wonder how vigorously does OMB look at those budgets that aren't annually reviewed by the Appropriations Committee? Do you look at those?
We spend an enormous amount of time on that. Let me just give you a few examples. I've already talked about the $375 billion in healthcare savings that we're proposing in the budget. That's obviously all on the mandatory side. We have a total of about 117 different cuts, reductions that we do.
You ever cut some of those mandatory? Well, let's talk about the CFP, because that's kind of what I was focusing on. They get a check from the Fed for $600 million. They were set up purposefully outside our appropriations process. But there was somebody did an independent performance audit of the CFPB, and they recommended that the Bureau expand transparency of their funding and expenditures. Now, do you think that's a good analysis? Some of these they're funded mandatorily. Do you think they'll be a little more open and transparent?
Well, CFPB is an independent agency. It's different from the vast majority of programs on the mandatory side.
So you never look at that one?
We don't have authority over CFPB's budget. So we do look at mandatory spending broadly in a range of areas.
And when you do you look at their transparency of their funding and their expenditures? Even though we don't, because we're not allowed to. Even though CFPB is not one of those, I guess OCC might be.
And we think that transparency is actually a very important tool in trying to keep costs down. Drug prices is an area where we actually have some innovative proposals in our budget this year to create more transparency, which we think can help to
But you don't
control
actually,
drug costs.
the CFPB is not one of those that's funded outside the appropriation process that you oversee.
It is funded, as you said correctly, through, as most financial regulators are, through
And that's not an area that you
or-
oversee.
It's not an area we oversee directly.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's go now to Mr. Serrano. Quietly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My concern, Mr. Chairman, is that it's probably more about the process and who we are. We're appropriators, and the Appropriations Committee has a reputation that in the 1990s became a dirty thought, that people could actually debate and then go have a beer after the debate. That's the essence of our democracy. That's who we are as a country. There are many countries throughout the world where people disagree and they try to shoot each other after the disagreement. But lately, maybe it's because it's an election year, but lately we've decided that President Obama is the worst president in the history of the country, that he's done nothing, that his people do nothing, and that they just drive up the debt, and they drive up the debt, and they drive up the debt. You know, we're a country, Mr. Chairman, that does worry about the senior citizen who doesn't have something to eat, and that costs money. We're a country who cares about a child going to school and has laws about a child going to school, and that costs money. We're a country that does try, not as much as I'd like to, and you're hearing this from a liberal, try to take care of our veterans to the best of our ability, although liberals usually, like me, say don't go to war, but when they come home, give them whatever they need. Give them everything. If it was up to me, they get a house, a car, education, everything just for putting on the uniform. And if they're not citizens and they go to war, the minute they put on the uniform, they become citizens. That's how much I respect our veterans. But I think we've got to understand that we have a process here, and we can't just blame one person. So he proposes a budget that we don't like. That's why there's a guy over in the Senate running for president that wants to shut the government every day, because he doesn't like for budgets that spend money. I have proposed budgets that spend money, but I think it's a disservice by us as a group, and I'm not picking on anybody, as a group, to forget that you and I were that close to voting on the same bill 2 years ago, until somebody in the Senate gave away a piece that even you were not interested in giving away. And that last year, we all voted for a bill that we weren't crazy about, but we knew we had to keep the government open and keep it working. So all I'm saying is probably something that nobody will pay attention to, is that he's a public servant, I'm a public servant, we're all public servants. We don't get selected, we don't get picked. We come and we beg people, be it at a Legion Hall, be it at a Foreign Wars place, be it in front of a subway station in the Bronx, New York, we beg people to vote for us. I'll be doing that pretty soon. My primary is in June, and I'll do it again for the 20-something time in my life to ask them to do that. But we've got to be a little more respectful of each other and a little more respectful of the process. I'll close with this thought. The worst word you hear these days is gridlock. Gridlock. Gridlock may be democracy working. We didn't come here to agree on everything. We came here to present our positions. In China, the budget is always on time. In China, the budget is always on time. Is that the system we want? And so rather than ask a question, I just hope that we face this year understanding what it is, and we know what it is, and we're trying to elect somebody president, and you folks are trying to elect somebody else president. I hope your nominee is that guy from New York. That'll be a good thing. But, you know, we still have a good thing going in this country, and we shouldn't make it sound like the country stinks. In fact, I'll close with this thought. There's a gentleman running for president who says, let's make America great again. You know what my answer is? America is great. We just need more people to share in its greatness. That's my philosophy. If I went around saying America's not great, I'd probably run out of town. You know, it is great. It's the greatest country under God's heaven. And we should preserve it by starting off and understanding what our role is and what we have to do to make it right. And one last point. If we, I don't know, maybe when you're born in a territory, maybe when you're born slightly outside the boundaries, you realize how lucky you are to be in this country and how lucky you are to be a member of Congress, and I see it like that every day. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Serrano, and I think we all feel like we're lucky to be Americans, and I think we all know that government needs money to provide services, but sometimes we have to be efficient and we have to make hard choices, and I think this has been and I'm sure there are a couple of more questions, and I don't think the director, my observation is we've worked together, and he knows there is disagreement on a lot of different issues, whether it's talking about the budget or whether it's talking about defense or whatever. So I hope nobody is kind of one of the problems in today's world sometimes is when people disagree, they tend to demonize the person they disagree with, and I don't hear any of that today, and I don't think that's a good thing. And so I think we've had a spirited discussion. We'll keep on having a spirited discussion. So I'll recognize Mr. Womack if he would like to be recognized.
I concur with the chairman and have an enormous amount of respect for the ranking member. We've had a lot of discussions, disagree on baseball and many other things. And I have an enormous amount of respect for Shaun Donovan, and I want the record to reflect that. I think the conversation we're having is healthy, and the country needs more of it. I wasn't around politics in the 1960s when 2/3 of the federal budget was the kind of government that we speak of here today. Ms. Lowy talked very articulately about investment of the federal dollar in projects that stimulate growth and development in our country, what we're doing in our harbors and in our waterways, building roads and bridges. Those are the kinds of things. I was a mayor. These are the kinds of things that the federal government does that helps give us a basis for economic development that creates jobs and opportunity for a lot of people. I just know today that the percentage of money out of our federal budget that is dedicated to discretionary spending, the government as we know it, is getting thinner and thinner, and it's putting a lot of pressure on these things, including national security, and that gives me a great deal of concern. And when I pressed the director about the date that all of our money goes to mandatory spending, it's somewhere out around 2030, 2035 in that time frame, which is not very far away, and we have to be addressing these issues. So, Mr. Donovan, thanks for your patience over the last several minutes. I'm sure you were beginning to wonder if your presence was even needed any longer, but I want to go back to a couple of things and seek your input. I want to go to paperwork reduction because we know the regulatory burdens facing our country today are pretty intense, and I know what the PRA was designed to do. Concerned a little bit that federal agencies are using the generic clearances process to avoid the requirements of the Paperwork Reduction Act. As you know, enacted to minimize information collection burdens, maximize quality of information collected. While OMB has recognized that in certain instances, a federal agency should not have to comply with the PRA's full requirements, these instances are limited They consist of situations where there's a need for multiple similar low-burden collections that do not raise substantive or policy issues, or specifies of each collection cannot be determined until shortly before the data are to be collected. OMB has provided 3 examples in which generic clearance is appropriate: customer satisfaction surveys, focus group testing, and website usability surveys. Even though general or generic clearances are not allowed for collections that raise substantive or policy issues, I understand that CFPB, as an example, has used generic clearance process to collect data on topics that it intends to issue rules on. For example, overdraft. Is it appropriate for an agency to collect information under a generic clearance process that will be used as part of its rulemaking?
So, first of all, I would just say again, CFPB is not under our, we have the power and we do consult with them, but we cannot direct them, and they do not need to follow generally our rulemaking guidelines. So in this specific case, I don't think it's my place to determine what's appropriate for CFPB, but I'd be happy, if there are other areas where you're concerned about this, I'd be happy to look at it and suggest whether or not we think it violates those, our guidelines.
Okay, well, let me ask, maybe not for the benefit of the CFPB, which is kind of the driver of this particular question, but what steps does OMB take to prevent agencies within your jurisdiction from abusing the generic clearance process?
So I would say we have a couple different ways. We do pursue kind of regular review of the processes that they're taking. There are also a number of outside agencies that will look at whether it's the IGs or otherwise that will look at these kinds of processes. The other thing that we're doing proactively is our regulatory look-back effort, which I mentioned. We've achieved over $22 billion in savings. A significant share of that savings does come from paperwork reduction. So I think it's important that we not just be enforcing our standards, but also working with agencies to find proactively new ways that they can reduce documentation. Truck divers, for example, we have a major rule at DOT we did last year that changes their reporting that dramatically lowered their costs there because of paperwork reduction.
Is the Paperwork Reduction Act having the desired effects? Could it be enhanced? Could it be better?
I do think, and this is really what the guidance that you're referring to, you just referred to, tries to get at. As with many things in government, we need to make sure that they're modernized to keep up with technology. And so we do see increasing use of customer satisfaction surveys and other things as critical to figuring out whether we're being effective as government, whether we're doing a good job. And I think the Paperwork Reduction Act wasn't created at a time when many of those processes existed. And so we do feel like, and we've tried to within our own guidance, I think it is worth having a discussion about whether there's some statutory changes that might be useful to try to modernize what it does. And I think in cases we may be missing things. I've seen a lot of cases where the paperwork reduction is actually creating more paperwork, frankly, than it's reducing because of modern technology.
I thank the Director. I have one other question, Mr. Chairman, that I'm not going to ask. I'll submit it for the record. A lot of attention has been given to the fiduciary rule, and I do have a question regarding it, but I'll submit for the record so as not to be respectful of everyone's time. I thank the gentleman for his work, his testimony today, and also for his previous work at HUD. Thank you so much, and for having a good-spirited and constructive debate today. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Graves is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to share my respect for the ranking member and Mr. Serrano there, and greatly appreciate your reflections a minute ago. And to Mr. Donovan, who has the unfortunate opportunity to be the first hearing after a district work period, and what you've sensed today is, in no disrespect for you or what you have presented to us, it is more of a reflection of what our job is, and that's to be the voice of our constituency. And coming back from a district work period, that's what we hear. And that's what you've heard expressed today. And I understand that we're the voice of our constituency, and obviously today you're the voice of the administration. And so there's very different roles there for each of us. So thank you for your patience as we've expressed our frustration that we have sensed the pulse of our districts. But on just a different matter, and I know you're a member of the National Ocean Council, and if I could just ask you a question or two about as it relates to that, can you just help us as a committee understand in terms of funds and personnel, how is that requested or how much is requested in the President's budget FY17, as well as maybe a historical, how many resources have been allocated through dollars and personnel since its formation or your involvement?
To be frank, I don't have that information at hand right now. I'd be happy to follow up and get you more details on that following the hearing.
If you could, with that, and that would be great if you would, maybe also include any of the annual reports that should be publicly available over the last couple of years for the committee. And with that, Mr. Chairman, that's all I have.
Thank you. Mr. Yoder?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Director, 3 quick topics. See what we can do here in 5 minutes. The first one deals with the gas tax increase in the president's budget. The president told students in Georgetown University in 2011 that rising prices at the pump affect everybody: workers, farmers, truck drivers, restaurant owners, students who are lucky enough to have a car. The president himself said a $10 rise in oil prices translated to a 25% rise in gasoline prices. Given the challenges that working people face already and the expense that they have from their federal government, I believe there's this challenge with trickle-down government where all these taxes and regulations ultimately hit working people in my district the hardest, the folks at the poverty line, the people struggling to get by, and Clean Power Plan is one of them. But in terms of this gas tax increase, explain to me why, given the challenges hardworking Americans are facing, why the president chose this time to put a gas tax burden on Americans.
Well, first of all, this is a tax that goes across oil, not just gasoline.
Fair enough.
On oil companies directly when it's produced at the pump, at the wellhead. But I think more importantly, we should also be focused on the burdens on families and communities that our infrastructure and the state of that infrastructure is producing. And so whether it's the hours that families spend caught in congestion, whether their inability to get to jobs or schools, we need to do something to make sure we accelerate our investment, not just in infrastructure, but smart infrastructure as well. And so we felt, and traditionally, this has been a bipartisan issue. We did reach a bipartisan 6-year bill last year, but there's more that we can do. And investing in the infrastructure of the future, whether it's driverless cars or a broad range of other areas, the research and development that we need on transportation, we think that those costs on families need to be recognized as well.
In 2008, Joshua Bolten, Chief of Staff to then President George Bush, issued a memorandum in May 9th to the heads of executive departments and agency, as well as the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, to encourage them to resist the historical tendency of administrations to increase regulatory activity in their final months. Later, Bolten noted that we did not intentionally jam or burden our successors. My question for you is, does the White House intend to issue such similar memo along the lines of taken by Chief of Staff to then George Bush in 2008? And at that point, of course, he didn't know if the next president was going to be a Democrat or Republican. They just said, let's not jam everyone up with tons of regulations. What's your position? What's the administration's position on that?
In fact, not just are we considering it. Howard Shalansky has issued a memo to agencies to try to lay out the fact that we will enforce very consistent standards on rulemaking throughout the end of the administration, and to encourage agencies to finish their work as quickly as possible, and to make sure that they're prioritizing so that we don't have a substantial, unusual amount of rulemaking.
Great, appreciate that, continuing that tradition. I want to finally ask you about the deeming rule. I know that's something that's under consideration for the at the OMB. FDA submitted final set of regulations to OMB. OMB has a 90-day period to review, and it can extend for another 30 days. We've currently passed that 120-day mark. So I want to ask you about that. And then I wonder if you've taken into account the regulatory burden in terms of the expense of implementing all of that when you have tens of thousands of cigars and vapor products, and not just brand name product, but each different variation in flavor and size and content. And I guess, so one, can you clarify where we are in the process, and we're past the 100-day review? When do you think you'll actually have a result on that? And then wouldn't it be less costly and easier to implement, and ultimately be, I think, more effective for the FDA to move the date forward for the newly deemed products, and specifically set standards for vapor products, because every single one of them have been made after the deeming date that FDA came up with. And so it seems like we're putting an unfair burden on my constituents who utilize those products, and maybe overwhelming for the FDA.
So given that this is a rule we currently have under review, I can't speak to the specifics, the merits of the rule. It has been under review, as you say accurately, beyond the 90-day period. As I said earlier, we will take the time it takes to resolve rules, to make sure that we get cost-benefit analysis done correctly and accurately. And I expect that we will finalize soon, but I can't give you a specific timeline on that, given that we are still under review.
All right. Well, as you're engaging in the review, those would be thoughts that you might want to take into consideration. I know you've had plenty of comments, and the FDA has as well, and I'm assuming those are the types of things you're wrestling with. So just want
I can assure you those are exactly the kinds of issues that we look at.
We appreciate your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Serrano, do you have any closing comments?
No, just to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the members of the committee for this hearing. It was spirited, and that's a good thing. And thank you, sir, for your service to our country, and and for making New York look good all the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I would just add my words of thanks to your commitment to public service, and we appreciate you being here today. That's what the legislative process is all about, a give and take, and just appreciate your spirit and the hard job that you have. So we look forward to continuing to work with you as best we can to make this a better place for all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.